Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In the last lecture, we talked about how the newspapers and magazines are treating feature in the present world. Under the present circumstances, we have seen that feature has been shortened and a lot of new elements have been added. That was actually the structural changes we discussed in the last lecture. Today, we are actually going to talk about how the present day feature is being written by the journalists. No doubt, the American influence in writing has started appearing in feature as well, and the Asian media, and particularly Pakistan, it has also been influenced by the Americans. Seeing this, there is a modern technique of writing features which was developed by William E. Blundell, who was a New York writer and working for the Wall Street Journal. This is called the Blundell technique. आपने देखा होगा कि जब भी कोई फीचर लिखा जाता है तो लाजमी नहीं है कि पहली ही अटेम्प्ट में आप बहुत खूबसूरत और बहुत बड़ा कोई फीचर लिख देते हैं. आहिस्ता आहिस्ता विद द पैसेज ऑफ टाइम यू गेट एक्सपर्टीज एंड यू बिकम एन एक्सपर्ट. इसी चीज को देखते हुए जब हम फीचर लिखते हैं तो आप एज ए नोविस जब आप शुरू करते हैं तो बहुत सारे इश्यूज आपके सामने आ जाते हैं. आपको ये इल्म नहीं होता कि कौन सी ऐसी डिटेल है जो कि डिलीट कर देनी चाहिए, कौन सी ऐसी डिटेल है जो कि आपने लाजमी पिक करनी है. कंसिडरिंग दिस, जब कोई पहला फीचर लिखा जाता है और बहुत सारे जो यंगस्टर्स आते हैं न्यूज़पेपर्स में वो अपना पहला फीचर लिखते हैं तो इट कैन बी ए टोटल मैस. व्हाई? बिकॉज ऑफ द फैक्ट दैट दे डू नॉट नो व्हाट आर द रिक्वायरमेंट्स ऑफ ए न्यूज़पेपर. और जब ये इल्म नहीं होता कि न्यूज़पेपर की रिक्वायरमेंट्स क्या हैं और जिस स्पेस में ये फीचर जाना है उसके अंदर आप कौन कौन सी चीज़ें इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं और कौन कौन सी आपको नहीं रखनी चाहिए. कॉन्सिक्वेंटली योर फीचर इज मोर देन लेंथी, इट इज मोर देन व्हाट इज रिक्वायर्ड, और उसका नतीजा ये निकलता है कि जो सब एडिटर्स हैं या जो एडिटर है उसके ऊपर बहुत ज़्यादा प्रेशर बढ़ जाता है. क्योंकि जब हम किसी भी चीज़ की, किसी भी फीचर की एडिटिंग करते हैं तो हमें जो सबसे पहला टास्क एज ए सब एडिटर होता है वो कंसेप्चुअली क्लियर होने के साथ साथ उसकी लैंग्वेज का होता है. अगर आप लैंग्वेज पे कंसंट्रेट करना शुरू कर देंगे तो ऑब्वियसली जो सब्सटेंस है वो सफ़र करेगा. तो बेहतर राइटर वो कंसिडर किया जाता है जो रिक्वायर्ड इंफॉर्मेशन देता है और उसकी वो रिक्वायर्ड इंफॉर्मेशन जो है दैट इज टेकन अहेड. कंसिडरिंग दिस, बहुत सारे लोग जब कोई भी फीचर करते हैं तो वो बहुत सारी डिटेल अपने सामने ले आते हैं और वो लिखना शुरू कर देते हैं. जब वो लिखना शुरू कर देते हैं तो उसका नतीजा ये होता है कि दे आर डायरेक्शनलेस. व्हेन दे आर डायरेक्शनलेस, दे डू नॉट नो what information they should be bringing in. They do not know what others' point of view should be brought in. Consequently, it is a total mess. For instance, एक यंगस्टर ने एक फीचर लिखा, किसी से इंटरव्यू किया, किसी से बात की और उसको लिखना शुरू कर दिया. Consequently, it will be what? It will be an article which is joined or packed in a box with a lot of snippets, such bits of news which are actually not closely connected. Under these circumstances, obviously your impression as a writer is destroyed. आपके पास choices जो हैं वो कम रह जाती हैं कि आपने क्या करना था और क्या आप कर सकते थे. नतीजतन आपकी एफर्ट ज़ाया जाती है. ये टेक्निक जो ब्लंडल टेक्निक है, इसको इवन नॉविसेस या आप जैसे जिन्होंने के फ्रेशली मास्टर्स किया या ग्रेजुएशन की, उसके बाद जब जाते हैं, इफ दे फॉलो दीज टेक्निक्स दे वॉन्ट बी रनिंग इन टू ए मैस। और जो मेसी फीचर्स लिख के आपको डिस्करेजमेंट होगी, आप उसको अवॉइड कर सकते हैं। कॉन्सिक्वेंटली एक जो एक्सपर्ट ओपिनियन है, आप उसको फॉलो करते हुए यू कैन कम अप with comparatively a better first or second effort instead of not learning it even after a passage of 5 years. बहुत सारे चीज़ें जो हमारे यहाँ कंसिडर की जाती हैं जब भी कोई फीचर लिखते हैं, उनमें से एक जो चीज़ है वो कि what is the material, what is the matter with the person, क्या लेके आए हैं आप और आपने उसको किस तरह आगे लिखा है। So your own concepts along with your writing capabilities is actually the requirement of the feature writing. आपको ये देखना है कि आपका अपना इंस्टिंक्ट क्या है और आप उन इंस्टिंक्ट्स को कैसे डेवलप करते हैं। जो एक और चीज़ हमारे यहाँ कंसिडर की जाती है वो ये कि जो एडिटोरियल पॉलिसी है उसके मुताबिक आपने कितना काम किया है। दिस इज वन ऑफ द थिंग्स जो कि बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट हैं। अगर आपने एडिटोरियल पॉलिसी से हट के सारे का सारा फीचर लिखा है, उसका नतीजा क्या होगा? योर जॉब विल नॉट बी कंसिडर्ड फॉर प्रिंटिंग। कहीं और शायद प्रिंट हो जाए लेकिन उस न्यूज़पेपर में प्रिंट नहीं होगी। हेंस योर एफर्ट गोज वेस्ट। व्हाट कैन यू डू इज वर्किंग अकॉर्डिंग टू द एडिटोरियल पॉलिसी। इसी चीज को मद्देनजर रखते हुए जो प्रेजेंट डे अप्रोच डेवलप की गई है और जिसके मुताबिक लोग अब भी काम कर रहे हैं, उनमें वॉल स्ट्रीट जर्नल का, जिस तरह मैंने आपको मेंशन किया, विलियम ई ब्लेंडल जो हैं, उन्होंने ही हैज आल्सो रिटन अ बुक द आर्ट एंड क्राफ्ट ऑफ फीचर राइटिंग व्हिच इज कंसिडर्ड टू बी ए हैंडबुक फॉर द जर्नलिस्ट। अब ब्लेंडल की जो टेक्निक है दैट इज फ्रीक्वेंटली बीइंग यूज्ड ऑल ओवर द वर्ल्ड और इसी टेक्निक को फॉलो कर रहे हैं मोस्ट ऑफ द पाकिस्तानी न्यूज़पेपर्स एज वेल। इट्स सिंपल एंड इट इज सिंपल टू फॉलो एज वेल। फॉर इंस्टेंस, चीज़ें ऑलमोस्ट वही हैं which are being traditionally used, but there are certain angles which are different, and those angles actually do what? They make you different as well. First, lead or intro. अब lead और intro क्या है? आप अपनी इंटरेस्ट तो जाहिर कर सकते हैं, but it is not necessary that if you are interested in something, the other person, the reader, is also interested in that. Your lead is actually what? Your lead is actually the point of beginning for the reader. लैंग्वेज के ऊपर बहुत सारे compromises लोग कर जाते हैं, लेकिन जो intro है, the way you have picked up the feature, the way you have come up with the writing of the feature is uncompromisable. And most of the people are actually doing what? They are somehow trying to come up with a language which they consider is of the highest order. When we consider that it is of the highest order, then it does not mean that your substance is also of the highest order. Language ठीक होना definitely is an important thing, but it does not mean that that is the ultimate thing. Substance आप जब लेके आते हैं, आप उसका आगाज कैसे करते हैं, आप अपनी रोजमर्रा जिंदगी में भी देख सकते हैं। द वे यू टॉक, द वे यू ओपन ए डिस्कशन, दैट इज ऑलवेज इंपॉर्टेंट। आप एक डिस्कशन ओपन करते हैं, आप किसी शख्स से बात करते हैं, इफ यू आर नॉट एबल टू come up to the expectations of that particular person, you're actually going to land in trouble, because the rest of the discussion, the dialogue will not be listened by that person. Consequently, your talk will be over, at least in the mind of the listener. When your talk is over, at least in the mind of the listener, consequently, you end up in what? You end up into almost nothingness. यही चीज इंट्रो का है. Intro or lead, whenever you're developing it, if you do not have a certain understanding of what you're going to do, of what you're coming up, you will be failure right with the word go. आप जब लीड लिखें या इंट्रो लिखें, आप लाजमी ये इस चीज का ख्याल रखें कि आपका इंट्रो पढ़ा जाएगा तो उसके बाद आपकी कोई दूसरी चीजें भी पढ़ी जाएंगी. इसी चीज को ब्लेंडल ने भी फॉलो किया है. इंट्रोस या इंट्रो एक पैराग्राफ का भी हो सकता है और 3 पैराग्राफ्स का भी हो सकता है. somebody who has missed the first paragraph or has not agreed to the first paragraph might come to the second paragraph, might come to the third paragraph. Ultimately, within first 3 short paragraphs, you will be able to capture the attention of the reader. ब्लेंडल इस चीज को फॉलो करते हैं कि आपके इंट्रो के अंदर डाइवर्सिटी होनी चाहिए. When you have a diversity, you're actually trying to do what? Trying to capture readers of varied interests. Consequently, you are better placed to capture the reader for the rest of the feature as well. Intro, कुछ लोग ये सोचते हैं, is the punchline. They think it right. And the same is applied by Blundell as well. आप intro को अपना forceful बनाइए through ideas. That is one of the things which is being stressed now. No doubt कि आपकी language की गलती वहां पे नहीं होनी चाहिए. लेकिन आपका intro जो है, strong intro also comes up not only with language, rather it is also importantly dealt with by the substance, the material. And when you're doing it, you're actually coming up with what? Coming up with a multidimensional aspect within 2 paragraphs, within 3 paragraphs, or with more than that. Obviously, you cannot stretch your intro or lead more than the 3 paragraphs. That is obviously against the traditional views which we have in Pakistan, or which were followed by the British newspapers. Frankly, जो हमारे यहाँ बहुत अरसा पहले तक फॉलो किया जाता रहा, those were the British standards of writing. But now, with the present day and with the US influence in other areas, obviously journalism is not left without the influence. Consequently, what we have what we call a mixture now. कुछ लोग अब भी जो इंट्रोज हैं वो 1 या 2 पैराग्राफ के बहुत मुश्किल से लिखते हैं. They try to concentrate on the first paragraph, try to come up with a forceful intro, consequently trying to do what? In other words, impress the reader. Remember, in today's world, impressing a reader is not of huge value. Rather, communicating something to the reader is of huge value. आपने communicate करना है. Communicate आप क्या कर सकते हैं? Obviously, communicate आप ideas करते हैं so that you can come up with a better option of lending into the minds of the readers. There is another way which is being practiced by the present day journalist or the modern journalist, is that of coming up with an anecdote in the intro. There is somewhat illustration of a situation where the reader is shown a picture so that he can visualize the next coming aspects of that particular feature. Consequently, you have what? You have actually a scenario where you place yourself immediately. Anecdote किसी भी चीज़ से कनेक्टेड जिस पे आप फीचर कर रहे हैं उससे हो सकता है, और आपके पास एक ये भी चॉइस होती है कि आप उस बेसिकली एक माइक्रोकॉस्म क्रिएट कर देते हैं इंट्रो में. थ्रू दैट माइक्रोकॉस्म or the situation of one or two individuals, you are actually going to treat the macrocosm. आप एक छोटे स्केल से बड़े स्केल पे अपने रीडर को ले जाते हैं. एक्चुअली इंट्रो का जो सबसे एक बहुत बेहतर एंगल इस्तेमाल किया जाता है वो ये, एंड वी से इट दैट यू हैव टू कैरी योर रीडर along with you throughout the feature. Consequently, when you're carrying your reader along with your feature, he is obviously taking interest and deeply absorbed into the feature. When journalists talk of beginning a storyline, the word they use is lead. It is because that they are like holding finger or holding hand of the reader to do what? To move along with them. An effective lead is what? Is actually dealing with the subject more certainly through the microcosm, a situation created at a small scale, and then to develop it at a large scale. Effective leads जो बनाई जाती हैं उनमें एक तो जो एनेक्डोट है उसका इजाफा हो सकता है, और एनेक्डोट्स यूज भी किए जाते हैं, मीन्स यू आर portraying some scenario, some situation. Consequently, you are at a place where you can do what? You can actually come up with a scenario and take your reader along. Secondly, effective lead is a promise to the reader that you have something important and interesting to tell. Consequently, whenever you are coming up with an interesting intro, obviously your reader is coming up with an idea that he has to move on. Good leads beckons, invites, informs, attracts, and entices the readers to read that particular feature. The best kinds of leads are anecdotal in nature. Remember one thing, when you're explaining a situation through an anecdote, through some incident, you're actually coming up with what? With the best kinds of leads. And these are considered to be best in nature. The short story is actually, which is written in the lead or the intro, is actually doing what? Is actually microcosm of the bigger issue. And there, the bigger issue is actually doing what? Is actually being poured into a very small place, and the reader is going to know what you're going to talk about in the rest of the article. Anecdotal lead is used to illustrate a larger topic. And obviously, with that, the reader is actually expecting something bigger later on. These are the anecdotal leads, actually are the mainstay of the present day feature writers, and they are coming up with that. When used well, these leads can be very effective in drawing the reader to the next aspect, which is called the nut graph. However, before moving to the nut graph, I'd like to share some of the observations which are made by the writers, by the journalists who are actually present-day experts. For instance, Don Wycliffe of Chicago Tribune says, "I look at leads as my one frail opportunity to grab the reader. If I don't grab them at the start, I can't count on grabbing them in the middle because they will never get to the middle. My leads are there to get you in and keep you hooked to the story so that you can't go away." That is actually what? That is the reason we are actually keeping our leads more interesting. As he has put, there are two things he is saying, that my lead is what my frail, feeble, एक मेरी छोटी effort है to grab the reader. अगर मैं उस टाइम पे रीडर को ग्रैब नहीं कर सकता, उसकी अटेंशन को ग्रैब नहीं कर सकता, कॉन्सिक्वेंटली क्या होगा? It will not be easy for me to grab the attention later on, and consequently you will be what? When the reader is not reaching the middle, you won't be able to get his attention. My leads are there to get you in. Your lead or the intro is actually there for what? To get the reader at that particular spot and get you hooked there did not want that the reader should be left with an opportunity, with a thought that what is he reading. So this is what the lead does. Secondly, Steve Lopez of the Los Angeles Times says, I might write the first sentences 10 different times. So in order to come up with an interesting lead, you are going to attempt as many times, maybe 10 times. Take a look at it, and it's not quite right. It's a right thought, but it is not the right wording, or it's the right wording, but it is not the right thought. So that person who is well known for all these things is actually what? He's actually concerned about the fact that he is actually putting right thoughts into right words. And if there are right words and the right thought is not there, he will again change it. Susan Trosh of the Boston Globe says, I have to have a lead or I cannot write anything. I have to have my first sentence because that is my whole piece. That is the tone that says what is the piece about. It's the theme, the thing by which everything hangs. If I do not have the first sentence, I just can't keep going forward. So Susan Trosh is actually concentrating on what? Is actually concentrating on the first sentence even. So that is the starting point. What to talk of 2-3 paragraphs when you are actually concentrating on the very first sentence. If you believe that your first sentence is going to weak and it is not going to get the reader's attention, then obviously what is going to happen? You are not going to be read by the readers. आपने अपनी मिसाल आप खुद देख लीजिए कि बहुत दफ़ा कोई बहुत खूबसूरत टॉपिक होता होगा, आप शुरू भी कर लेते होंगे, लेकिन उसके साथ प्रॉब्लम क्या होती होगी? उसके साथ प्रॉब्लम ये होती होगी कि आप थोड़ा सा शुरू किया, उसके बाद आप बोर हो गए. What is this? आप फिर आगे नहीं पढ़ते. That is the weakness of the writer. Remember one thing, that your write-up or your newspaper is not a compulsory reading for almost all the people. It is actually what? It is actually a voluntary reading where somebody is trying to read, not under compulsion, but with unintentional intentions. Then comes the nut graph. Nut graph or the angle. This explains your entire intention, what you want to do with that particular article. And it is done in a nutshell. You must know what you're going to do, what you are trying to communicate to the reader. Many writers find the nutshell or the nut graph is actually one of the hardest things to do. A lot of information you have at your hand, but you do not know what angle you should be taking up to communicate to the reader. Because when you have taken up one angle, whether it is what, it can be politics, it can be anything, you have to stick to that and you will be communicating that to the reader. Once you have figured out the nut graph or the angle, obviously you are going to land with that particular thing and you will be consequently doing what? You will be actually dealing with that particular angle for the rest of the piece. Secondly, in the same paragraphs, you have to do what? You have to actually do the connection activity between the lead and the angle which you have taken up or the nut graph which you have taken up. The intro highlights maybe of an individual case. The nut graph illustrates how the individual case is actually representative of the bigger trend or how it is going to affect the overall scenario. This is a well-known formula which has been used by the Wall Street Journal, and countless other publications are also using it today. So central to the approach which we are dealing with, the Blundell technique, is actually the nut graph. And without it, obviously, it is not possible for you to have a story. Blundell calls it the main theme statement, the single most important bit of writing I do on any story. That is what it's the main theme of the statement. Many writers usually do what they really struggle to find the nut graph for their stories. That you have to do, and this is what you understand when you're actually covering various features on various things in the effort to write a feature. This is because if somebody is facing a problem in coming up with a nut graph, it is actually the problem with the understanding that somebody is not clear about that particular idea as far as the subject is concerned. You have to address the questions like, what is this story really about? And if you have the answer, what this story is really about in one word, whether it is greed, politics, sacrifice, loss, redemption, family, hope, freedom, whatsoever it is, you have to tell that you are actually covering it from that particular angle. It could be any of these things, but you should be certain about it. Once you know that what your story is about, obviously you can change the focus onto that. It should have a story, a single story should have one single dominant impression. And that impression is obviously what we call as the angle, as mentioned earlier. Now, you all to do with the nut graph, you have to do is to express your angle in 2 or 3 sentences. Your angle should be expressed, or your nut graph should be expressed in 2 or 3 sentences immediately after the intro, so that the reader knows what you're actually going to do. For instance, if there is a situation where you're talking about the government, and you say, or you feel, or you want to communicate that the government has actually failed in doing something, then you have to tell the reader that your feature is actually about the failure of the government. 2 journalists, Thomas Boswell of the Washington Post says, the most important thing in story is finding the central idea. It's one thing to be given a topic, but you have to find the idea or concept within the topic. That's true. Your concept should be there straight right in the story. Then he proceeds on, once you find that idea or thread, all the other anecdotes, illustrations, quotes are pearls that hang on this thread. जिस तरह के हीर वारिस शाह के बारे में कहा जाता है कि वारिस शाह साहब के मुर्शद ने कहा था कि तुमने रस्सी में मोती परो दिए हैं, इसी तरह ही आपका जो नट ग्राफ है वो एक रस्सी होता है, और जो बाकी इलस्ट्रेशंस हैं, पिक्चर्स जो हैं, वो सारी की सारी एक्चुअली क्या हैं? Those are the pearls in which they are being treated like beads, and that rassi or that thread or that nut graph or that angle is actually going to do what? Is going to hold all those illustrations, those quotes, all those things. He further proceeds, the thread may seem very humble, the pearls may seem very fleshy, but it's still the thread that makes the necklace. So, to Thomas Boswell, a feature is a necklace which is actually figured out by the writer, by the feature writer. So, you're actually creating what? You're actually creating a necklace in the name of feature. Ken Wells, who is actually the editor of the Wall Street Journal, he comes up with something really different. And he says, a paragraph that says what this whole story is about, or what you should read it, that's the reason why you're reading it. It's a flag to the reader high up in the story. You must have seen flags on buildings. So nut graph is comparing with a flag on a high building. You can decide to proceed or not. A reader is going to decide whether he should proceed on that particular feature or not. that's his choice. Then you can decide to proceed or not, but if you read no further, you know what is the story about. If you do not proceed further after the nut graph, you're actually doing what? You're actually knowing what is the remaining. Third portion, which is considered to be also an important one, that is the main body. And the Blundell technique is actually considers various angles of the features, various informations as blocks. In Blundell technique, the main body is actually formulated by what? By blocks of information. Articles consist of several blocks, each representing a thought, an aspect of the main story. That's where you're actually putting up various blocks. You must have seen a building. एक बिल्डिंग जब बनती है तो उसमें क्या है, मुख्तलिफ जगहों पे मुख्तलिफ जो खिड़कियां लगा दी जाती हैं या अलमिराज होती हैं या विंडोज़ होती हैं, जो कुछ भी होता है उनमें, those are actually what? Those are actually part of the building. Consequently, when those are part of the building, you are actually coming up with what? You're actually coming up with the whole building. So the feature is actually what? Is actually a main story where the different aspects, different informations are acting as what? As blocks. It is always a good idea to prepare your blocks with quotes, examples, more interesting and more enticing to the reader and considered to be more credible, because your blocks or your information is actually going to do what? Is actually going to keep the reader interested in the feature. To organize materials of these feature writings, stories, you have to divide that under these blocks, or in these blocks you are actually going to talk about the statistics. In these blocks you are actually going to talk about the present situation or whatsoever. That's where you're actually coming up with various blocks. They say it that the main body of the story is a series of information blocks, but they are not about time, they're organized by subject. So these are actually to be done by what? These are actually to be done by the subject. And the story, for instance, if you have to do a story about egg production or something otherwise, you should consider various angles in that, and we have already discussed as far as these things are concerned. You are going to arrange these blocks in a way that these support each other best way. Obviously, you have to connect them as well, and you have to bridge these blocks. Without bridging these blocks, you cannot move on, and you frankly should be coming up with what? With certain situations where your all blocks are very well connected. Introducing each section and organizing the story in a better way. Block structure actually is of overwhelming considerations. What we can do, each block should make its point, and it should have its own observations on angles. Angles, I'm not saying the nut graph, changing that, no, it is not like that. Like each block should have a particular information. Proofs and illustrations. Sometimes it is better that you have 1 or 2 illustrations, but don't come up with 4 or 5 illustrations, because these will be overkilling or something which is going to be overburdening the feature. However, there are 6 key blocks which are used by Blundell in his feature stories. Those are history, coming up with the background, then the scope, what is the extent of the problem, that is the second one. Cause, what is actually happening. Fourth one is the impact, what impact is actually creating, how the people are being affected by this. Then action of the contrary forces, what is being done by the others, what about the situation in which the other forces, maybe animate or inanimate, are actually doing it. And the future, how the coming weeks or the coming days, months or years are going to actually do to this scenario. That is, you have to look, these are the 6 things which are to be considered in the main body, and these should be actually covered up very well. Then we come up with the situation where we have blocks, and they say not all these blocks need to be included in your final story. If you want to avoid somewhat, you can, nor must they appear in order they presented well. Obviously, as far as the above ideas which have been given to you, these should not be presented in that order. If you want to change, you can definitely change that. But if you have a material to answer all the 6 questions or the 6 portions which I have told you, you should be giving that particular material in that. That is where your main body is actually going to function. Then we come up with a conclusion. Conclusion, interestingly, we people are actually doing what? We are actually concentrating a lot on the conclusions, on the intros, leaving the body or the nut graph. Nut graph is not very popular, was not very popular with the writers a few years back, but obviously we are coming up with the angles. Conclusions should be ending with a punch, and in feature writing, if lead is important, the equal importance is given to the conclusion. You know, you have to carry your reader with you till the conclusion, and your conclusion is actually connected to the intro. There are several types of conclusions, but the best kind, which is obviously of the bundle technique, and that is coming up with a passage, either summing up or reinforcing the central message of the story. That is where the reader is actually gaining a message from whole of the story. A good ending is actually positively doing what? 3 things to the minimum, as says Bruce De Silva of the Associated Press. To him, there are 3 things. First is what? Tell the reader the story is over. That's interesting. In our day-to-day life, बहुत कुछ होगा कि कोई शख्स आपसे बात कर रहा है, आप सुन रहे हैं, and there is a break. Abruptly, आप कहते हैं बात खत्म हो गई. So this is what it is. If you have finished your story, your reader must know that it is what? It is the end of the story. There is nothing remaining. So you have to do it what? You have to do it in a way that your reader knows that the end of the story has come. Second point about which the Bruce De Silva talks, nail the central point of the story to the reader's mind. Nailing the center point, the nut graph, into the reader's mind, saying, gentlemen, this is what I was talking about. Gentlemen, this is what I was carrying along in my feature. And the third is resonate. आपने सुना होगा कि कानों में आवाज गूंजती है. जब कोई रीडर पढ़ता है तो उसके दिमाग में आइडिया गूंजता है. I'm just giving you a simile because आपके जहन में एक आइडिया डाल दिया जाता है and that stays there. This is the success of a writer कि जब वो अपना आइडिया देता है, that idea stays. Or that is why Bruce De Silva said it should resonate, and he says you should hear it echoing in your head when you put the paper down. When you turn the page, it should stay with you and make you think a little bit. Means it should be making the reader think a lot. Think about that particular angle or the story. There are 3 conventional types of what we should say the endings or conclusions which are being used today, and those are partially mixture of the Blundell technique. On the other hand, it is also partially with the scenario we have been through. Like the default one, which is used by many writers, is to end with a snappy quote from somebody or an anecdote which is mentioned earlier, quote which somebody has spoken earlier, but it is a lazy man's approach, and we consider that when you have actually what, you are actually not in a position to come up with certain strong idea. You are actually coming up with what? With something which is you are unable to figure out yourself. You say, okay, I come up with that quote and just close it. That is considered to be a lazy approach. Then the better approach, which is considered to be conclusion to the lead, if you start off with a particular anecdote, you also end it with the related anecdote. And occasionally this approach is used, but it is considered to be a better approach. First one is the quote. You're repeating that, lazy, considered to be lazy approach. The second one is coming up with an anecdote or with an incident where you're actually coming up with you're referring to the incident. But beware, it can get a bit too long or too bad in certain cases, and it is not that often used. However, the best approach which is being used, and it is providing facts, summing up and reinforcing the central message of the story through facts. You can use a specific detail, a concrete image, a fact, a statistic to conclude the story, but its impact should be memorable. So out of these conclusions, the first one is obviously not approvable. The second one, sometimes you carry it too far, where you are coming up with an anecdote, or where you're coming up with an incident, or where you're coming up with some explanation of a situation. You reinforces it in the conclusion, then that might be a bit of overdoing. However, still, which are the conventional thoughts and which are considered to be one of what the usual things being used by the present day journalists, is that of reinforcing the message of the story, reinforcing something which is of a bigger value right in the beginning, and then coming up with the conclusion with the strong impressions which are actually being created in the end, and your reader is actually made to do what? Made to concentrate again in the end through facts and figures. So these conclusions are actually going to work out a situation where you are actually making certain situations clear, and then you're making it happen through certain angles. So when you're concluding something, you're actually doing what? You're bringing the final shape to the write-up. And here, when you have written it, there is one suggestion, and that suggestion is reread your stories. If you're not going to reread your stories, probably you are not going to be a better writer tomorrow. And in journalism, we say that there are a lot of people who are actually doing what? Who are actually coming up with certain strategies of actually becoming good writers. हमारे यहाँ कुछ ऐसे लोग भी हैं, कुछ ऐसे हजरात भी हैं, और ये भी देखा जा सकता है, और जब आप फील्ड में जाएंगे, when you will be working for some newspaper or somewhere, आपने ये एक चीज़ देखी होगी कि, और ये देखेंगे भी कि कुछ लोग बहुत खूबसूरत एक्सप्रेशंस ओकेजनली इस्तेमाल कर लेते हैं. वो खूबसूरत एक्सप्रेशंस आते कहाँ से हैं? एक्चुअली मोस्ट ऑफ देम आर आइदर कीपिंग डायरीज, और उन्होंने कंप्यूटर में कोई ना कोई एक फाइल सेव किए रही होती है. उस फाइल में वो एक्चुअली वो इंटरेस्टिंग एक्सप्रेशंस जो हैं वो उनको यूज कर लेते हैं. मैं आपको ये सुजेस्ट नहीं कर रहा कि आप वो जो बहुत बम्बास्टिक किस्म के एक्सप्रेशंस हैं उनको पिक कर लीजिए, उनको यूज करना शुरू कर दीजिए. लेकिन ये एक चीज किसी हद तक अगर कमजोरी है तो स्ट्रेंथ भी है कि आपने हेडलाइंस 2-4 उठाई, उनमें से कुछ मिक्स की, लाइक यू पुट इट इन ए पॉट एंड मिक्स किया, हिलाया जुलाया, कुछ अंग्रेजी का वर्ड इधर से उधर लगाया, कुछ उधर से इधर लगाया, और आपने कर लिया. अभी जो बात कोट्स की गई, कोट्स क्या हैं? इज एक्चुअली what an easy approach of doing something. जिसका नतीजा क्या निकलता है कि the reader ultimately gets the idea that this man was tired of completing his feature according to his wish, and now he has done what? He has just simply broken down it abruptly through a code. So, if you try to do what? If you try to beg an information which is actually taken from some other source from somewhere else, you might not be ending up with something really good. So one of the ideas which you must keep is try to be original in your conclusions too. वो जो मैंने आपको सिनेरियो बताया है कि जिस सिनेरियो में लोग ये काम करते हैं कि जनाब हम उठा लेते हैं कहीं से, कुछ प्लेजराइज कर लेते हैं, कुछ कॉपी कर लेते हैं, that is always a bad idea. What I prefer or I'll recommend you is you must be trying to be as original as possible. क्योंकि जब आप ओरिजिनल होते हैं you're actually different from the others. This is for sure. Your originality is never similar. जब आपकी ओरिजिनलिटी सिमिलर नहीं है तो obviously you're a different writer. So try to become a different writer. ये जो मैंने आपको टेक्निक्स बताई, ये जो ब्लंडल टेक्निक बताई, it is not the Bible as they say. अल्टीमेट नहीं है ये, लेकिन these are the guidelines. इन गाइडलाइंस को आप अपना सकते हैं, आप जो है वो इनको आगे बेहतर कर सकते हैं. व्हील इन्वेंट हो गया, लेकिन आपने देखा कि अब व्हील की कितनी शक्लें हमारे सामने हैं. इसी तरह ही आप इन ब्लंडल टेक्निक्स को जाओ, या जो आपको पहले बताई जा चुकी हैं या जो बाद में बताई जाएंगी, वो फाइनल नहीं है कि नथिंग बियॉन्ड दिस, लेकिन आप उनमें कुछ ऐसी चेंजेस ला सकते हैं जो कि बेहतर हो सकती हैं. इसी तरह ही कंक्लूजन में भी चेंजेस लाई जा सकती हैं. आप कंक्लूजन्स अपने एंगल से, अपने जो आपकी थॉट है उससे कर सकते हैं, बजाय कि आप क्या करें कि आप किसी घिसे पिटे को, ट्राइट किसी ट्रेडिशन को आप जो है वो फॉलो करना शुरू कर दें. सो द बेस्ट वे इज दैट यू ट्राई टू somehow reinforce the idea that you're going to end it this way. जो एनेक्डोट की सिचुएशन है, जिसको कि बेटर सिचुएशन कंसिडर किया गया है, उसकी प्रॉब्लम जिस तरह के मैंने आपको पहले भी वाजे की है, वो ये कि आप जब बात कर रहे होते हैं और अगर आप बात रिपीट करना शुरू कर देते हैं तो दूसरा शख्स जो है वो आपसे तंग पड़ सकता है. समझाने के लिए बात तो रिपीट की जाती है, लेकिन आप इंसिडेंट को जब रिपीट करेंगे तो उसका नतीजा क्या निकलेगा कि दूसरा शख्स विल बी इरिटेटेड. यस, इफ देयर इज समथिंग यू कैन कम अप डिफरेंट, देन डेफिनेटली जो आपने पहले एनेक्डोट दिया है उससे वो मुख्तलिफ हो सकता है, और कॉन्सिक्वेंटली आपका वो एनेक्डोट जो है दैट कैन बी कंसिडर्ड as one of the things which should be mastered in a way that it is not repeated in totality. एक चीज होती है inference, एक चीज होती है reference. आप किसी चीज को रिफर करते हैं, ऑब्वियसली आपका माइंड इंसाइट होता है. आप किसी एनेक्डोट को किसी प्रीवियस जो आपने पहले मेंशन किया है उसके साथ रिफर कर दीजिए, और आप ये इन्फर करवाइए. इन्फर मीन्स समथिंग विच यू वांट दैट द रीडर शुड बी एक्चुअली डिड्यूसिंग फ्रॉम दैट. आप ये सोच करवाइए कि वो सिचुएशन ऐसी हुई थी, अब ये सिचुएशन ऐसी है. व्हाट आपका जो एंगल था, जो नट ग्राफ था, इसका मतलब वो ठीक था. दिस इज व्हाट यू हैव टू डू इन योर कंक्लूजन. यू हैव टू प्रूव कि आपने जो एंगल लिया है, जो नट ग्राफ आपने बनाया है, that is actually true. And how you're going to do it? You're actually going to do it through reference, a minor one, not overdoing it. And if you will overdo it, then obviously you will lose your impression. This is the second, and it is considered to be better, but not the best. And traditionally, as I was saying earlier, कि री-इन्फोर्स करना सारे के सारे एंगल को, सारी की सारी सिचुएशन को री-इन्फोर्स करना इन दैट पर्टिकुलर पैराग्राफ इज समवॉट ट्राइट, बहुत ट्रेडिशनली इस्तेमाल हो चुका है कि आप फैक्ट्स लाते हैं, आप ये बात कह देते हैं कि जी गवर्नमेंट ने यूं नहीं किया, जी सोसाइटी ने यूं नहीं किया, या जो कंसर्न्ड डिपार्टमेंट्स थे या कंसर्न्ड जो इंडिविजुअल्स थे, दे हैव डन समथिंग रॉन्ग। अब बात तो ये कर लेते हैं, लेकिन उसका नतीजा क्या निकलता है कि इट लुक्स एज इफ somebody is banging your head against something which you already know. So avoid such a situation where your reader thinks कि आपने कोई पुरानी बात दोहरा दी है. So the best way is that you are actually doing what? You are politely communicating your message for the final time in your conclusions. अब जब आप conclusions draw कर लेते हैं और कंक्लूजन्स को रीइंफोर्स करने के लिए सबसे जो बेहतर तरीका है वो ये कि उतना ही टाइम कंक्लूजन्स को दीजिए जितना आपने इंट्रो को दिया था या लीड को दिया था. देखें, अगर आप कंक्लूजन के ऊपर पॉइंट नहीं करते हैं, स्ट्रेस नहीं देते हैं, तो उसका नतीजा क्या निकल सकता है? उसका नतीजा ये निकल सकता है कि द मैसेज यू एक्चुअली वांटेड टू कम्युनिकेट इज एक्चुअली नॉट गोइंग टू बी देयर. और उस मैसेज का नतीजा क्या निकलेगा कि आप जो कुछ कहना चाहते हैं वो पहुंचेगा नहीं. कॉन्सिक्वेंटली आपका जो फीचर है दैट विल बी समहाउ लाइफलेस. तो द बेस्ट वे इज कि जब आप कंक्लूजन्स ड्रॉ करें, जब आप किसी चीज़ के बारे में बात बताएं, तो आप एक्चुअली डूइंग व्हाट इज एक्चुअली गिविंग एन इम्प्रेशन that you want that something should be happening this way. And this is what you can do in your conclusions. Bring the mind of the reader to the message you want to communicate, and you want that he should be constantly thinking about that. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.